Welcome, my name is Erica Hunt. I'm on staff here at Woodland Hills. Most of what I do is related to the Resanate ministry, which is 18 to 24-year-olds. And a lot of you here are in that ministry, but many of you are not. This event is, we are going to have events like this 4 times this year. This is our second one. And we like to invite a little bit younger students, younger than the Resanate age, and a little bit older. So this is for 16 to 30-year-olds. And you are all very, very welcome here. We're very glad that you are here this afternoon to hear from our wonderful panelists. So there were a couple things on your chair when you sat down. One of them is a small sheet of paper that you can use for questions. So at any point, as you're listening to the panelists talk, if you want to just jot down your question, Kristen in the back, Kristen's the one waving at you over there. She will just hold up your question and she'll collect them, and then during the last roughly half of our time, we'll read your audience questions for the panelists. The other thing that you have is this, and this really just there's a brief explanation of who the panelists are. We're not going to take time for them to do introductions because you have that in front of you here. And so take time to read those. They included their email addresses, which is pretty awesome. So if you hear something today and you didn't get a chance to ask your question or you didn't think of it until later, they've all said that they would be happy to hear from you at another time if you want to continue the conversation after today. So that's what this handout is for. Today's topic is, we're answering the question, how can we live out a value of justice in our everyday lives? And that's a great question. Justice can be kind of confusing, kind of complicated, a little bit scary, a little bit intimidating, but very, very close to the heart of God and all the way through Scripture and through the history of the church, for good, bad, or otherwise. And so we are just really here at Woodland Hills. We value tackling difficult subjects and doing it in a way that honors differences and really puts God's heart at the center and say, okay, how can we learn from each other, and what does this mean for my personal discipleship journey? How can I follow Jesus more based on the kinds of things that I'm learning today and what God calls us to as people? So there might be things that you hear during the conversation that are different from what you think or have understood or your personal experience, and we just ask that you remain open to that and just have a spirit of what is God teaching me and revealing to me through this. Our panelists are volunteering their time today and have been in touch with me for a couple of weeks, months, 1 week in Jason's case. And so we just really want to honor their contribution to this conversation today. So like I said, we're really glad you're here. I'll just pray, and then we'll start with some of the questions that we have. Lord God, we thank you for who you are. We thank you that you are so much bigger than ourselves and than the things that we understand, Lord. But you invite us into that. And you encounter us, Lord, in very real ways that transform us. And so, Lord, as we think about this topic of justice and what it means for the church, what it means for us, we just ask that you would be very real and present here in this conversation, Lord. We thank you for the panelists and for everybody here, that you would really speak to us in ways that challenge us, Lord, and stretch us, because we know that that's when we so often grow closer to you, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen. So the first question, and I sent these guys a few questions at the, like a week or two ago, I guess, and we're going to start with those. And like I said, please be thinking of your own questions, and we'll get to those just in a little while. But the first one is, and we can go in any order, whoever's ready, or we can go down the line, I guess, but whoever's ready, share how your commitment to following Jesus impacts your value of living justly. So what does your relationship with Jesus have to do with this? Whoever wants to start, go ahead.
I can go ahead and start. I'm Elizabeth. I guess most people here probably know me as Lizzie. And I'll be talking a lot about consumerism and ethical consumerism today, so I'm really excited about that. And I was really struck by what Greg talked about in his sermon today, if all of you were there, about partnering with God in our decisions and our actions. And to me, living out justice means that we're partnering with God. Like, those two things intrinsically go together. I think that if we're asking God how we should act, how we should spend our money, what products we should be buying, it would will inherently be just because God is just and God is good. And so part of my journey with learning how to try and live more justly has been learning how to better like communicate with God and include God in my actions. And kind of my specific passion would be learning how to include God in my consumer decisions. You know, what am I buying? How is that impacting other people? Is this purchase going to add value to my life and to the lives of other people? Is it serving my neighbors, and is it loving my neighbors? So I think those things really need to go together.
I can go next, ladies first. Well, my name is Cristina, and my last name is Platagui. My son is sitting over there in the back row, Pablo. Not just I am, Pablo. And I'm from Spain, not from Duluth, so bear with my accent. You might have to fine-tune your ears. But when I think about justice, I think about wholeness. And the way I understand Christ's life in me, I think of his desire for wholeness, for us to be whole as individuals, as communities, in our relationships, and in our society, and in our life. So I think of justice like flowing directly from the heart of God. So when I think of how I was thinking about the same thing you mentioned, Missy, with the sermons, how I partner with God, it just comes directly from what He is doing, first of all, in my life and in my heart. And I think of the verse of James 1:27, which is paraphrased, basically says, take care of those in distress, the orphans and the widows, and while you do that, make sure that you don't contaminate yourself with the world. And for me, it's that calling to really life commitment to humbly seeking God's heart, discipleship and inner transformation, so that He shows me where the power imbalances are around me and in my own life. And then what do I do in the area where I'm standing? For me, it happens to be as I teach at a college and I work in mental health. Those two very different worlds. It's like, what do I do in those worlds in my daily life? But I would say that the centrality of really depending on Jesus, so I don't fall prey to the injustice of self-righteousness. It's key. I get very excited about causes, and I forget relationships. And I think that is where the heart of God is.
Hi, my name is Daryl. Hi. I currently serve as Associate Professor of English Education with the Urban Teacher Program at Metropolitan State University. And that's out of the way. No, I think I'll talk more around the issue a little bit. I was looking at these questions this week, and I was really coming up with it was hard for me to come up with sort of a neat response, because I think justice is enigmatic. And then recognizing that there's sort of four of us with different pieces of the justice puzzle, if you will, then I think I'll frame my response according to privilege. Right? Two things. First, in relationship to Jesus. He was God and had all this power, all this privilege, if you will, that could have been used in the ways that people traditionally use power. And He used it in a very different way. Right? And so for me, I never asked to be born. I just sort of wake up, right? You're this little thing, and you're being raised, ideally, in this environment, and you're acquiring ways of thinking about the world before you even have any say-so. You're breathing in the air, if you will, of consumerism, of race, of class, of gender, of orientation. By the time I'm actually like an independent thinker, if such a thing actually exists, you realize you've already been shaped and framed by all these discourses, these ways of thinking and believing and valuing in society. And so when I think about privilege in my life, again, there wasn't a checkbox. I didn't get to say, well, let's see, I'll pick United States. Yes! Healthy country. I'll go with white. Yeah, that'd be good. Male, check. Straight, I'm in. Tall, thin, wow. And I'm not saying, I hit the privilege jackpot. Arguably. That is to say that if we think of our identity, not necessarily, I mean, yes, our identity is tied up in Christ. Christ holds us together. He holds all things together. And yet I have these different aspects of my identity. My masculine way of thinking, if you will, my white way of thinking, if you will. If we look and think about these different aspects of our identity, we recognize that in the society we live in, that some are privileged and some are marginalized. And we recognize that that's unjust. Agreed? So, for example, the fact that I'm able-bodied is a privileged aspect of my identity versus if I was not. And we can go on each of those. Now, I grew up in economic poverty, so in that one, I was not privileged but marginalized, and I think that's been the window that's opened up so much for me. So, in ways of opening statements, I'll just say that when I think of privilege, first I recognize that Jesus is the ultimate example of having all of this and then using it to serve others. And so in my life, it's like, what does it mean for me to be a white guy who does justice, a straight guy who does justice, an able-bodied guy? I think you get the idea. So yeah, I'll make that connection.
My name is Jason Como. I read this question: how your commitment to following Jesus impacts your value of living justly. When Erica called me, I said, I think maybe I said this a couple days later when I called her back, but I said, what is justice? And then I said to my wife, do I live out justice in my life? And I thought, oh, whatever. I don't even know, what if I don't do this? How can I be speaking about it if I don't even know if I do it? And I thought about it, and how does Jesus impact this? And I went back to this verse, or actually said this. It's something Greg Roy wrote. We don't go here anymore, but Greg Roy wrote this a few years ago, I don't know when, in his book, Repenting of Religion of All Things. He said, see, first of all, to set up some context, I work with people, I minister to people every day in my job as a physician. And so it seems like, well, justice is just doing justice. And then I thought about it, and I thought, well, there's several thousand physicians in the cities who could be sitting up here doing the same thing as I'm doing. So do I really do justice as my job? Because a lot of my students will say, the money, underlying a lot of the motivation to do medicine is still money, because it's a good job. There's sort of always going to be sick people, and job security. That's the phrase I was looking for. So how do you? So one thing that Erica helped me with is she said, I want you to talk a little bit about the difference between justice and charity. And I've gone on many medical mission trips, which I love, and I love being able to do that. When I live in Minnesota, as I always say to my wife, if she's not here, if I have to be in Minnesota, I'm doing the job exactly where I want to be doing the job. So I work with the homeless. I have 2 half days a week where I'm in a shelter, and another half day where I get to go downtown St. Paul at 4 in the morning and look for people who are wandering around and sleeping on the rocks and stuff. So this is all great. But I realized that I still had no answer for Erica's question. Well, how is this not just charity? And I remember this because I've used this in writing different things when people ask me to talk about myself. Greg wrote in his book, Repenting of Religion, Pastor Dr. Greg said, to heal the sick, you have to love the sick, which means you have to fellowship with the sick. And that is, I think, God's heart of justice for people is me getting on my knees as a physician and clipping somebody's nails, washing somebody's feet, saying, when they're telling me, you don't want to go down there, it's gross. And saying, yes, I do. This is why you're here. I'm not over you. Jesus said, the pagans rule it over them. But I have come as one to serve. And so wherever we do it, whatever we do, this is doing justice. I mean, our world is full of other ideas about how to look at this stuff. I've trained. I've gotten this award. I make this much money. And I can refer this person to somebody else to do this. But that's not what Jesus said. And so if I'm gonna, I don't know if this is justice or not, but that's what I do, as I say. And then when your students see that, they go, some of my students say, yeah, he does a lot of foot care. Like, you know, and I'm a family physician, so I'm a family physician, and that sort of doesn't necessarily fit. I mean, I can refer a lot of people. You know, Christina will talk about later about immigrants and stuff. You know, I have a lot of patients I can't refer because a lot of them don't have the right paperwork to be in this country. But I don't check that out. As far as I know, there isn't such thing as an illegal human being. You're human being, you know. So that's sort of, I don't need to know that. I just need to know, as Greg always says, all I know about this person is they have this insurpassable worth. They're in front of me, and that's how I'm supposed to treat them. So I try and, you have to live that message sort of every day, because it's easy to go astray, even this has. So
No, that's great. Thank you so much. This next one is kind of a two-part that you can maybe answer together if it's helpful. What were the primary influences that led you to engage in justice in the particular way that you do? And then if there's a specific story or experience that kind of crystallizes that you'd like to share.
I can go. I can answer from a position in life where I actually have two very different jobs that don't seem to fit very well together, but that's what I do. So I work 2 days a week at Bethel University and I teach languages. And the other 2 days I work with immigrants and refugees in mental health. So two things that don't, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and also I'm a professor of language. It's like I am two people. And particularly my work with language, teaching languages, it took me a while to realize that justice is a thread that is woven together. And this is something that we heard, Eric and I went to Portland to a justice conference years ago. And I remember that it was for me a moment when I realized that everything we do is God will use for His kingdom. I teach online language classes with a quote by Flora Lewis, who says that learning another language is not just learning to say the same things with different words, but learning to think differently. And I realized that even when I'm teaching the colors and the objects in a classroom setting, I'm encouraging people to see the world from somebody else's perspective. And to realize that was a shift for me in how I engage in something that I was doing with very little passion. I was just doing it, And then I began to realize that the things that we do have a huge impact. Then I began teaching, and I was offered to teach a class on immigration, and that was when I realized, wow, really teaching can be a powerful instrument. What we do in the classrooms as an academic setting, that can really have a transformative influence, not just in how we think, but how we act. So for me, that was that point when I realized that there's no certain professions that fit better than justice work than others. Anything we do, what we purchase, what we do, what we say, the things we watch on television, just make a huge difference. And the other part for me as I work with immigrants and refugees in the mental health profession, 90% of the clients have post-traumatic stress disorder. They've been through war, and if they haven't, just the immigration journey is traumatic enough. And if you haven't had trauma during the immigration journey, just living in a different hostile environment is traumatic. So something that for me last year was key was realizing that when I was listening to their stories, there was something that I did at certain times that created connections, and some other times there was not that connection, and I didn't know what it was. And talking to my supervisor made me realize that it was the difference between compassion and solidarity. When I hear somebody's story and I feel for them, it has very little impact beyond the clinic. But when I hear somebody's story, and not only I feel for them, but I enter the story and I advocate for them and I say, what you are living is unfair. And I actually take a stand, is transformative. Like there's something that happens where the connection and the relationship, the therapeutic relationship, just transforms to empowering both the mental health provider and the client. So for me, it was just like really not being afraid to say, that should have never happened to you, and I am sorry. Let's see what we can do here. It was a huge risk because we're supposed to have this facade of therapeutic, very, very distant and be the expert. And for me, it was like, yeah, this is the heart of God. But it was scary to do that. So.
Daryl, you ready?
Sure, I think I've lost track of the question.
Oh, I'll repeat it. What were the primary influences that led you to engage in justice in the particular way you do, and if there's a story that captures that?
Sure, so again, I come from a background of economic poverty, so I'm from a sleepy little town called Gary, Indiana. Did you know I represent? Murder capital in the 80s. And so my older sister lived with drug dealers. My sister was pregnant and lost her when she was 15. The two of us graduated high school, often didn't have to eat, often didn't have food. I came to Christ as a teenager, and in those years, this is how naive I was. I honestly thought that's what Christianity was. Because everybody I knew in poor urban communities, if you were a Christian, we all helped each other. So I loathed school. It was utterly disconnected from my reality. When I finished high school early, I joined a Christian community with a little street ministry in downtown Gary. And so I'm 18 years old, I'm carrying out groceries, and we're picking up homeless people off the street that come and live with us. And so it sounds funny talking about it now because for some of you you're thinking, wow, that's a really uncommon experience. But it was just normal life to me at the time. And so this idea of what shaped my commitment to justice. Now, of course, in those years, helping people, administering to them, yes, it was a meal and it was, trying to help people get clean and sober and those sorts of things. But it seemed like an endless loop. And so it was years later, I think it's mentioned in a little blurb, so after high school, I worked in factories and nightclubs, everything you could do. And then when I was 25 years old, I started college. And I started college because I thought I wanted to change my job. And by the time I was done, I wanted to change the world. So I mentioned earlier, the idea that I have these identities and many of them are privileged. I didn't feel privileged when I was growing up because sometimes there can be a single aspect of your identity that's so marginalized within a society that it shapes the way you view the world. I couldn't see any other privileges that I had talked about. But when I added education to the equation, then suddenly I realized a lot of the privilege that I had in society. Granted, although W.E.B. Du Bois talks about it in terms of race, I have a double consciousness of social class, right? It's funny, I'm a professor, a doctor guy, and I still see the world through social class lenses and issues of poverty and justice. So to the question, I would say my life, my upbringing shaped that, and I don't know what else I could do. Oh, I should add one more thing to that. So, in addition to teaching at the university, so my passion is urban education. So I consult with urban schools around achievement gap issues, discipline issues, and I'm happiest when I see statistics dropping and student populations improving. That's when I get really happy.
Awesome. Well, remember your questions, you guys. If you have anything that just hold it up, we'll move to that portion of the discussion in about 10 minutes.
Yeah, I love what you said, Christina, about moving from compassion to solidarity, and I think that has been really influential in my own journey to live out justice. And I think my faith has been a big influencer as well. That my faith really planted the seeds to sort of have the knowledge, we're supposed to feel compassion for people. We're supposed to be kind and loving to people, to our neighbors. And I went through most of my life feeling like that meant being kind to the people who I interacted with on a daily basis, the people in my workplace, the people who I live next to, my peers, people I've gone to school with. And I think that's, still really important and vital as Christians, but more recently I've sort of realized that our neighbors really mean all of the people and living creatures and forms that are on this earth, and realizing that in such a globalized world, even my most mundane everyday actions can end up impacting people who are thousands of miles away, or maybe they're just in a neighborhood in this state where I don't go, and so I don't interact with them and don't realize that my actions have impacted them. And an experience that really helped me, I think, move from that place of compassion to a place of solidarity was I studied abroad in India in college, and interacted with people who were being impacted by a lot of issues, things like climate change, things like factory labor. A really poignant week of my life, probably the most influential week of my life, was spent in a city called Tirupur, India, where 90% of textiles are produced in India. And I spoke with a woman named Lakshmi who had worked as a child laborer in these factories. Her life had just been totally ravaged by the years that she spent as a factory laborer. She'll never be able to have children because her body was so destroyed basically by the work conditions that she was in. And being able to really connect, me purchasing, maybe just a $10 t-shirt at Target or wherever isn't really just purchasing a $10 t-shirt. It went through this whole process before it got to Target, and I never thought about that process. I guess I never really thought about the true cost of the items that I was buying. So it was really that moment of speaking with Lakshmi and realizing there are human faces and human lives being impacted by where my money is spent. And I might have sort of known that these things happen. I had the knowledge or logically knew it in my head, and yet I never had sort of absorbed it into my body or into my being in a way that was motivating enough for me to actually make changes. So to me, it's very important to be able to know people's stories, to be able to put stories or faces to our actions, to our practices, to be informed not just about the facts, but also to have actual humans that we know are being impacted by what we're doing. So something that I find really helpful is to picture somebody like Lakshmi when I am at a store and tempted to buy something that I don't really need or that isn't actually adding value to my life. And I think if Lakshmi was standing in front of me right now, would I really think that I needed this pair of jeans? Would I really think that this was more important than her livelihood and well-being? And that's very motivating for me to be able to also be willing to maybe spend a little bit more money somewhere else for a company that is maybe more expensive, but I know treats their workers ethically, or I know that is making a positive impact in people's lives.
I also would like to use Christina's sort of narrative.
So I'm going to patent it.
Okay. Not before you patent it. Going from compassion to solidarity for me has been, I can think of a few very strong images in my mind of places where I've been. In 1987, I think I was 12 or something. I remember there was a big volcano in the country that I was born in. And the volcano melted a bunch of snow, which grabbed some mud and decimated a whole village in a valley. And I remember seeing the pictures of that. This is in Armero, Colombia, and I'm from Bogota, but another place there. I remember seeing those images as a child, as 10, 11, 12, and compassion, it kind of hit me right here in this thing. in the gut. Say, anyway, I won't go through the derivation of that word, but so I looked at that and I was so impacted, sort of, with the devastation. There was this picture of this person, all you could see was their arm under this mudslide. And I remember going into my bathtub and laying in my bathtub and sort of recreating that. Just so struck me that I had my hand out and everything, and I was just taking a bath, and I think I let water be in my mouth and this and that. And I wouldn't remember this as well, except my mom, for some reason, came into the bath. Maybe I was 10. Or came in the bathroom, and she grabbed me by the hair and pulled me out of the tub. And that was how it hit me. So fast forward a little bit. Compassion still isn't really solidarity yet there. So a few years ago, about 12 years ago, I started doing my second 2 years of medical rotations on the south side of Chicago. And I grew up in Minnesota, and I didn't realize there was such a racial disparity in healthcare. And they have hospitals essentially for people who can afford them and who can't, and usually it's by racial lines. And I didn't realize this, so I had to go through and spend a couple of years watching all these poor, sick black patients get dropped off at our hospital, where we as medical students were doing things that I couldn't do as a resident when I returned to Minnesota a few years later, on people. And we were trying to help them, don't get me wrong, but we just didn't know what we were doing. And we learned a lot. And I realized that started to change me. It started to make me look at things different and how people were treated differently. There started to be a narrative where, what's going on here? And then another story is, a few years ago after the earthquake in Haiti, which some of you have probably heard of, January 12th, 2010, it was a huge earthquake, killed estimates between 250,000 and 1 million people right around the capital city. Well, I went there to do some medical work, and I have a son who was 6 at the time, and there was a mom, or I think it was a grandma, who brought in a child who was much smaller than his stated age of 6 would be, but he was laying limp in her arms, and she put him down and asked her how long had he been sick. We just had gotten there the day before, my little team. How long has he been sick? Oh, just a couple days. And I felt his stomach, and he had a really big liver, which told me this isn't a couple days old. And I left quickly, and I said, we got to get him somewhere else. He doesn't look good. And they said, this is the Doctors Without Borders hospital we called down the road. They said, well, if he looks that sick, we're not going to be able to do anything for him either. I said, but you'll be able to do better than us. We just arrived here from the United States. We're just a new team. There's one physician, and there were 4 nurses, and we were just like setting up. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the clinic had just opened. I go back in, and he starts to gasp, and I start to do CPR, and he dies. And I'd never seen that here. And all I could think about was my 6-year-old son, who's alive and well and eating and doing everything here. And I thought, how do I reconcile this? And this is where you start to go from sort of that compassion to solidarity. And a lot of it has been, for me, starting to learn about the people of Haiti, for example, and meeting Haitians, not hearing necessarily what the news says, but actually meeting Haitians and saying, you know, my little resources, my little time that I can offer at this point to go over there is absolutely, they're worth it. They're worth it as much as my kids are worth it. And sort of, how do you kind of build that in your life? And the same thing sort of went through my time in Chicago, that you start to realize when you ask stories, when you sit and you say things like, that shouldn't happen to you. That doctor should have admitted you in spite of the fact that you don't have insurance or that you are a different race or whatever. Because I know that they would have if it was somebody else. And I don't think they even understand why they didn't, but they didn't. And that makes me angry. And it makes me say, we've got to do something here. And so working within the system sometimes is the way, working outside of the system, and sometimes doing a little of both. is sort of where it's happened, and there are many good doctors in the cities and this and that, but it's sort of made me ask questions instead of the first thing thinking somebody's non-compliant, thinking, why isn't this person doing what I asked them to do? Well, what will get in the way of that? Instead of automatically labeling somebody as this and this and this, saying, who's this in front of me? Why don't they want to take care of their health? Maybe there's something else, and almost always there is.
Thanks so much. We have, do you have any questions yet? Okay, I'll keep going. If you guys don't have any other ones to add, that's fine. I have a few more here. What is, and this is, you've been hinting at this a little bit here, but what is the most challenging for you as you prioritize justice in your everyday life? Here's some things you pray against, yeah?
Not alienating people like I'm speaking to here, or my own family, with lots of notions about who the people I serve are, and why they're there and how they got there. And that's where this is great, like rebellion of religion, like collapsing a lot of us as a body of Christ, collapsing a lot of our judgments is really a challenge. And it's harder for me to speak to, like I've taught at Buffalo to the PA program at Buffalo than it is for me to speak to my homeless patients, to my racially diverse patients. Much harder to speak to a group like this. Not you guys particularly, but because it's like we're in there's this chasm, and I don't understand it, and trying not to anger you, but to get you to start to think outside of the preconceived ideas that you may or may not have. And to remember that God called us to love people. I was thinking about this morning, I purposely don't follow a lot of news anymore. I like NPR, but I can't listen to it because it just angers me. And not because of what they say, but because of what's going on. And I realized that maybe one of the things, and I just wrote this down as I was thinking, we can't listen to what society says about society. We need to listen to what Jesus says about the person in front of us. And I think it's true, because otherwise, we get lots of things like thinking of current enemies in our world. ISIS, evidently. I don't even know anything about them, but I know that that's who we as Americans will say are enemies. And I think Jesus created them too. Doesn't mean we don't say they're good or what they're doing is good, or whoever did this terrorist. But how do we move beyond just saying let's hate them for the Lord? Or I don't know how you put those things together, but they're also God's people, and how do we pray for them? And let's pray for this crazy president in Jordan, or wherever he's from, Syria. In Syria, we actually, in our church this morning, we prayed for the president of Syria, which, we've got to be doing, because obviously our bombs aren't fixing him. And does he need to be fixed? I think so. I think there's a lot of things that need to be fixed. The bombing shouldn't have happened, but they have. And as Christians, we can make a difference in this world. But I don't think we can do it using the world's weapons. Maybe you disagree, but I don't think we can do it using the world's weapons. So we need to do it a little different. The good thing is, I think Greg and Eric and everybody here is pretty on to that. So,
I want to pick up on this topic of solidarity. And this is going to sound funny, and again, I want to share snippets of my life and some of these ideas. But again, growing up in economic poverty, being a racial minority, I was always in solidarity. I represent marginalized communities, right? That's where I was always most comfortable. I'm not kidding when I say the groups of people I never did understand. I never understood wealthy people or even middle-class people. To grow up like I grew up was we defined ourselves against people who went to college and would leave their families, because to us, family was everything, right? This sort of thing. And so one of the things Jesus has done for me is he's helped break down some of those socially established ways of thinking in my mind of which groups I'm a part of. Certainly my identity is in him. But to touch briefly on this idea of privilege, recognizing the time is short. So then my uncommon story, right, sort of coming from homelessness to Harvard and the world. Now, when I go into places on committees and gatherings and groups, people see me, and hey, I'm Dr. Parks, right? I can put on cool stuff, a little fancy. I'm able to carry the voices of those that I am in solidarity with to that conversation. I can bring the voices of my African American neighbors and my Hispanic neighbors, of their concerns about education, their concerns about justice, right? I can bring the concerns of the GLBT community growing up and the marginalization within public schools and trying to find ways for people to be safe and for people to be able to thrive and ideally for everyone to come to Christ. Right? So when I talk about privilege, it's using whatever it is that I have in this poorly constructed social world to try to lift up those who don't have the voice at the table, those who are not present, and those whose identities or lives have caused them to be marginalized in society.
Something that I find hard for me, and I have to explain a concept so that you might understand it. A few years ago, I came across the concept of cultural humility, and maybe like it's really used in medical world, as opposed to cultural competence, where you are trained so you are competent now, and you know it all about this other culture, and then you interact from a position like, okay, I know how to relate to this minority. So in the medical field, they use the concept of cultural humility, which when I was able to dissect it, I realized that, gosh, this is directly from the heart of God. It really stems from the point of really a long life commitment to self-examination and growth, which is really discipleship and inner transformation. And then the second tenet is really looking at what the power imbalances are in our society and around us. In my family, am I treating my children like the children of God who they are, or am I using my position to really frustrate them? I'm glad Pablo.
Well, I was going to ask. How's she doing, Pablo?
Or in my working environment. And the other one is like, what is the institution going to do about it? Once I'm aware of this, what is the institution? I'm saying that because what I find hardest is to remain faithful to the long life commitment of really examining myself. And that is really hard for me. It's been particularly hard around the political discourse regarding immigration. And if you watch the news, you've been aware of that. And for me, to really being able to humbly stand up and speak about when somebody's calling immigrants illegals, and say, nobody's an illegal. Actually, it's not a crime to cross the border without documentation, because immigration law and criminal law are two different parts of the law. So just being able to engage in conversations without sounding arrogant, and at the same time not allowing for language, to really perpetuate things that are not true. To not be ashamed to say that, yes, I have a lot of friends who have no papers, and they would not be ashamed to say that, and it's not a crime. And if we don't say that, nothing will ever change. And to advocate, and to use the power that I have, because I have documents and I can advocate to use it, to use the powers and the privilege that I have, and not just, use it to my advantage. So, but of all, the hardest part is to really commit to a marathon and not just a sprint. To realize this is a long life journey that is God's work. He is the most interested in a just world. He is the most interested. He wants to cooperate with me, but it's not my job only. It is His kingdom. I'm here to serve Him. So I forget that so often when I watch the news, and I get all irritated, and I want to post things on Facebook, and just like, okay, it's like, okay, calm down. It's like, what would Jesus do, right? I mean, to sound a little stereotypical, but that's true. What would Jesus do? Let's just look at the heart of God and then take action.
That was similar to my number one challenge I thought of also was that I find it so easy to be completely overwhelmed by the amount of injustice that exists in our world. And we're surrounded by it every day, and I feel like every day more and more about what's going on around me and globally, and I can find that like so overwhelming that it becomes debilitating. Like I just kind of like bottom out, or like you become so overcome with emotion, like I don't want to just feel anymore, if that makes sense. And to be able to remember that ultimately God is good and God is love, and at the end of the day, that's what wins. Like that's what's important. To be able to step back from that like bombardment of injustice that is so easy for me to focus on, and realize that God has a bigger picture for us. God has a kingdom vision for us, and I find that so empowering. Like there's so much that we can do. There's so many actions that we can take, and they might feel small. Like maybe it's just a conversation. Maybe it's choosing one time not to buy that one item that you really realize you don't need, or choosing to spend a little bit more money from a company that you know has better ethical practices, or donating to an organization that is advocating for worker rights or for human rights. That's what's like important to focus on, but like very frequently I find myself unable to see that that big whole picture. And then just also want to reiterate that it is like a very slow, lifelong journey, and those steps are little steps, but they make a difference. And every time that we say yes to acting and living more justly, it gets a little bit easier to say yes the next time, and to like take another step, and to just continue to grow in our understanding of what justice is, and our understanding of what God wants for us, and what it means to be kingdom people. So that's like a big challenge for me. Something that I try to work on is seeing what is it that God wants for us, what is it that God wants for me, and how do I like continue to be motivated to be able to say yes and continue to be challenged to keep growing.
That's great. That's a great segue to the last question. I wanted to offer, and you hinted at a little bit, especially you, Lizzie, but could you share some suggestions for the audience here? A couple of ways that the people here, all of us, can, especially maybe, you know, if we're newer to the journey or newer to this exploration or conversation, what are some suggestions that you have?
I'll stick with that theme of moving from compassion to solidarity. So if your background is different from mine, then maybe you do want to start building new relationships, right? So because I work in education, we always have a need for tutors with struggling readers, struggling writers, kids who need mentors, ideally kids whose background and lives differ from your own. You know, beginning to develop a relationship with a single individual can open the door to building broader relationships with the family, with the community, and in a short period of time you can find yourself not only helping kids, but also living a different sort of experience.
My suggestion is very similar to yours. It's about hospitality, and particularly when it comes to immigrants. There's, people think 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. I have a lot of friends who are immigrants who have never been in the house of somebody who speaks English. They've never been invited. They don't know what it looks like inside. And a lot of us, we volunteer in churches, but we still maintain a position of authority. We're coming to serve, we're coming to help. But just coming to be a friend, just play soccer. I want to play soccer with you. I want to have coffee. I want to relate to you as equals, as opposed to I'm here once again to perpetuate this thing where I'm in a position up here and you are depending on me. So be friends, just simple friends, you know. Go and say, I want to have lunch with you. Can we go have lunch? Or if they invite you to your house, go and spend time. I think that is very important. It has helped me a lot. It's very enriching.
actually wrote down some notes here. Explore your world. Read history, but be selective, knowing that almost all of history is written by the winners. Know that justice is in part a posture submitting to being taught by the least of these, and often puts you in direct conflict with the power brokers of our society. You need to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. I think I see that a lot in my work and teaching. People to survive, especially some of the people that I work with, have developed really elaborate ways of telling the truth sometimes, and have had to do a lot of things to survive. So you can get easily duped, and everybody gets duped, and it's okay. Be okay with that you're gonna make some mistakes, and you're gonna learn from it. When I say like read history, like I didn't know this, but when I came here, I see the new Jim Crow here. I'm reading that, and I just think it's so interesting when you actually read the history about things like our prison system. Like, why does a family physician need to read about that? Well, if I don't, then everybody that I see who's coming out of jail and treat, I won't understand what that was like and how that our society just maybe has some things set up that disproportionately affect certain groups of people and not others. And it's good about that. I mean, even just something simple like understanding that there was a cocaine law in the books, that something like 500 grams of powder cocaine was equivalent to 5 grams of crack cocaine, and you get the same federal sentence for both. Even though as a physician, you don't need to be a physician to know this. If you check the urine of somebody who's using crack or cocaine, powder cocaine, that the same benzo or organovil or whatever will be in the urine, either one, whoever's using. In other words, they're using the same drug, but the federal prison sentence was much higher for crack users. They're using much less than for powder users. And what's the difference between the two?
Crack's cheaper.
Overwhelmingly, the users of crack were black inner city people, and white powder were suburban white people. That's the only difference. So we had a law in our books for years in this country, and we've done a good job making a big business of filling up prisons in this country. But we haven't looked at the law, and the law did recently change a bit. It's now, instead of like 100 to 1, the ratio is like 8 to 1. So it's still in favor. So if you're going to use powder versus
Write that down on your notes.
So that's what I'd say.
Well, I want to add my suggestion, and I'm a reader. A lot of you know that about me. So there's a couple on the back here that I just want to go through it quickly. All of the first one I actually have with me, so if you want to take a closer look at it, you can. The first one I loaned to Lizzie a while ago, and she's still borrowing that one. So Everyday Justice, it came out, I think it was published in 08 or 09. I read it right away. I got it at a conference, and it really changed like daily life decisions that our family has made and stuck with for 7 years. And so it's very practical. It's an easy read, great for discussion. So if a couple of you would want to read that together, that would be great. The next one is, this is the one, it's Prophetic Lament. And like I said here, it's really about doing what we don't like to do, and that is acknowledge and suffering and grieve that, and be able to say it's a lot of that solidarity, like this should not be, this should not happen, this is not what God designed. And so Soon-Chan Ra is the author of this. He's a Korean, he's in Chicago now, he spent years in Boston, but powerful book that really gets at the heart of entering into the experience, so it doesn't become just sort of a pat, sort of like, sorry, and I'm going to go do my thing, but really about entering into the experience. Let Justice Roll Down is, but some of you have read this. I know Hannah looked at it. She's like, oh, I remember that book. John Perkins wrote this. He's an African-American from Mississippi. He's in his 80s now, at least, maybe his 90s. He's really considered like the grandfather of the Christian civil rights movement, so to speak. And a powerful, powerful story of his journey towards embracing justice instead of hatred. After his brother was murdered by whites in Mississippi, and he was almost beaten to death. So it's just a really, really powerful story of God working through him, and he's affected really millions. He's an internationally known leader. So great read. The Heart of Racial Justice is a co-authored book. This is an old one, Christina, we read this together. Daryl too, we all read this together. Brenda Salter McNeil and Rick Richardson, they really look at what does racial reconciliation look like for the church, in the church, how can the church be agents of bringing healing and wholeness, specifically along racial lines. The other ones that I didn't have on the sheet because Danny told me I couldn't take up too much more space, he's my graphic designer. But this one, Jason just referred to it, I read it this summer. It's really about the mass incarceration of Black and brown people, and over the last 30 to 40 years especially. Powerful read, difficult read, but really opened my eyes a lot. Michelle Alexander is a lawyer, I believe out east somewhere. And then this one is on my list for Thanksgiving break. Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. He has an awesome TED Talk that you might want to look up. I believe it's called the same thing, but I'm not totally sure. And it's really, again, he's a lawyer that this is kind of a memoir about his journey towards really looking at justice that works for everybody and not just for some. One thing, I'm glad that you have Greg's book here, because none of the books I recommend are by white men. They're all by women or people who don't have the same voice. And Daryl, I think you did a great job. Because we're good. He said it so well at the beginning, but by the time we even realize who we are, we've been shaped and we've been crafted and we've been given voice or not. And so a lot of us have white men, theologians, I mean, being here at Woodland Hills, of course, but a lot of that voice is really out there, and we've heard a lot of that voice, and that's important. But we have to look a little harder and be more intentional to get other voices. So all the books that are recommended are from different voices. And then there's just two other websites. Live 58 is an organization. They produced a documentary that we showed here several years ago about Isaiah 58. Beautiful passage. I encourage you to read it. Just integrate it into your life. And then also the Justice Conference, Christina mentioned, we went several years ago, and a group from Resanate went in June. It's in Chicago every year now. And if you just go to their website or like them on Facebook, you'll see, they'll introduce you to a lot of different authors and speakers and voices around this conversation that you might be able to find interesting and look into a little bit yourself. So with that, we're gonna bring it to a close here. And again, if you guys are okay to stay for a few minutes, if you guys wanna come up, but otherwise, their emails are here if you want to continue the conversation. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And the bin in the back is for your dishes. So appreciate it. Thanks a lot.